The lives of our clients have been changed by virtually every case we do in one way or another. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's the change of a rule, sometimes it's only their day in court and a chance at justice. Americans today are beguiled by the big lie, if you will. The big lie is that America is fraught and doctors are overrun and beset with so-called frivolous medical malpractice suits. I've tried many medical malpractice cases, and I assure you that not a jury that ever left one of those, win, lose, or draw, had a suspicion or an intimation or an inkling that it was a so-called frivolous lawsuit. They don't exist. If they ever did, they don't exist in America today anymore. And people who are obliged to go to a courtroom because of a medical mistake are there today because they need to be there because of what happened to them. Our work, after all, is about justice in the courtroom and about changing the lives of every single one of our clients for the better. That's the hope, the mission that we have every time we walk into a courtroom or take a case for someone, that we're going to be able to help them and make a difference, a positive difference in their life.
Every day, somewhere in America, more than 300 innocent men, women, and children become victims of medical malpractice at the hands of incompetent and negligent doctors. Last year, over 98,000 victims were killed by doctors. More than 4 million victims are permanently injured each year.
Today, the Insider Exclusive goes behind the headlines and when doctors go wrong, getting justice in America. To examine how Victor Pribanic, founding member Pribanic and Pribanic, got justice for his client in a very difficult and challenging medical malpractice case. Victor Pribanic has earned the highest respect from citizens and lawyers alike as one of the best trial lawyers in White Oak, in Pennsylvania, and in the United States. His goal is not only to get justice for his clients, but to make sure that everyone is treated with equal respect and dignity as guaranteed under the Constitution of the United States. His passion is problem solving. He approaches each medical negligence case as a scientist and as a lawyer trying to solve a puzzle. And because he's seen many patients suffer needless pain and injury, he makes it his dedicated mission to get legitimate, truthful answers to tough questions and issues, which result in hospitals and doctors being more responsible to patients and society. These successes drive him to help more people who have been harmed by incompetent and negligent doctors. His goal? To make medicine safer and more accountable. Victor has built a substantial reputation by consistently winning cases other law firms have turned down. His amazing courtroom skills and headline-grabbing success rate continue to provide his clients with the results they need and the results they deserve. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from White Oak, Pennsylvania.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Victor Pribanic to the show. Welcome to the show, Victor.
Thank you, Steve.
Tell our audience a little bit about your firm, what type of law your firm practices.
Our firm does injury cases of all kinds. We represent people who have been hurt by our medical institutions, manufacturers, and transportation issues.
Mm-hmm. There are two types of lawyers in this country. There's ones that represent corporations, big business, and that sort of thing. And then there are lawyers like yourself, typically called plaintiff lawyers. You represent the small person, the person who cannot afford to go hire a lawyer. So when you take on a case, it's usually on contingency.
Always.
Meaning that you have to put your time, your money at stake. How do you evaluate cases when you take on cases like these?
When we take on a case, we are really partners with our clients, our injured clients, and In the medical malpractice world, we look at cases exclusively where somebody has serious injuries or is killed as a result of a medical event. There are many cases that the medical institutions basically get a free pass for because they do wrong things, but they don't hurt anybody so badly that it would ever make sense to pursue it.
Today we're here talking about a medical malpractice case that you did pursue, the case of Natalie Swartz.
Correct.
Would you please tell our audience a little bit about who Natalie was and what this case is all about?
Natalie is a little girl who was injured at birth because she was suffocated. It's a tragic circumstance that still goes on today where children are monitored when they're inside their mothers. They're attached to what's known as a fetal monitor.
Which for our audience is a way for the nurses and the doctors to see how the baby is doing in the womb.
Right.
Correct?
Exactly, and it's a predictable thing. It's a wonderful resource, and it can save babies from the horrors of brain damage from asphyxiation. It's like a little telephone, if you will, that the child can say on the fetal monitor strip, I'm having some trouble in here. I need to be delivered soon, and if it gets clear enough, the fetal monitor says, there's like the baby saying, I need to be delivered immediately to be safe.
And in cases like this, and in this particular case with Natalie Swartz, what didn't the doctor do?
What was not done here and is not done in these cases that end up in a courtroom is somebody misinterprets, misreads, ignores the fetal monitor strips or supplies too much of the drug that induces contractions, Pitocin, that stresses the babies, and they're hurt. It's basically this common, most fundamental human failing we have. It's a negligent failure to pay attention to things that can injure or kill someone.
Yeah, and I want to point out for our audience, because of the doctor's mistake, this person, Natalie, is condemned for life to suffer as a result of their error, right? For something that could have been prevented.
For life and her parents. I mean, Natalie has, compared to some other children, some wonderful capacities. She's in relatively good condition, but she's not the person she ought to have been. She's not the little girl God created. That was all changed by the damage to her brain.
When you have a case like this, what are some of the legal issues that you have to prove?
Well, you have to prove that the doctor, nurses, hospital, whomever, fell what's called below the standard of care. This is uniform across the country. And in a given setting, doctors are required to do a certain minimum, minimum amount of care, what the reasonable, ordinary amount of care that another doctor would do, another patient would get at any hospital around the country. It's not the best. They're not required to show that they did their very, very best, only that they met the standard of care. If they go below that and don't deliver a baby when other doctors would agree that it was required, then that's negligent, and a jury ought to return a verdict in favor of the patient.
Now, this sounds rather simple, but gathering the evidence can sometimes be really challenging, right?
It can be. Medical records then, medical records today have evolved. Today we're in a world of electronic medical records that's very complicated. Then they were mostly written records, but anybody who's poured through thousands of medical records then or now recognizes that it's a daunting task.
Yeah.
Fetal monitor strips are relatively easy to look at, and we do things to try to make those clear to jurors. We have them animated like a cartoon, basically, so you can see the fetal monitor strip in real time during a trial. And they're challenging cases, but rewarding cases. These kids that are hurt this way and the families that are obliged to care for them and love them over their lifetimes always need a great deal of financial help. Their lives will never be great, never be the way they ought to be, but they need a great deal of help just to be cared for decently.
I'm just kind of curious, what was the defense's claims as to why it was not their responsibility or fault?
These cases always boil down to the baby was already in bad shape before he or she was delivered. The mom had some sort of infection. The mom didn't have appropriate prenatal care. There's a short laundry list of go-to defenses that you see from these experts all the time in virtually every case. Sometimes with some legitimate grounds to them, often not, however.
In a case like this, you put on your experts, correct? Right. And the other side puts on their experts.
Right.
So it comes down to the jury, who, if you go to trial, it comes down to the jury to decide who's more credible, right?
Yes, and that is a very, very difficult battle. Everywhere around the country, people, in spite of the hue and cry from the media and the doctors' laments about these lawsuits, people do not want to believe that their doctors, their hospitals can hurt them. It's a natural psychological device that psychologists are well aware of. They don't want to vote against doctors and hospitals, so it's a very difficult burden. And you have to have good experts. You have to always tell the complete truth. And very often, to win one of these cases, you have to point out that the defense experts, who are often the Ivy League, hallowed hall experts that the hospitals and doctors can get to come to these cases, are not being completely truthful and completely fair and completely open with the jurors.
Everybody knows the movie The Verdict with Paul Newman.
Yes,
and
great movie.
In the movie, Paul Newman, the lawyer, the plaintiff's lawyer, he wants to hire an expert who's a leading physician, a cardiologist, or whoever it was, maybe leading in their field.
Right.
But that person obviously has conversations with some of his contemporaries, his peers, who recommend to that doctor not to testify.
Right.
We don't want to testify against each other. So Paul Newman ends up hiring an expert who really doesn't have the kind of credentials that he was looking for, and the other side tears him apart by asking him, how many times have you testified? Do you do this for a living?
Right.
How do you, the reason I'm bringing this up is because how do you, with your experts, how do you get doctors to testify for you when there's a big influence from medical associations not to testify against your fellow doctors? And how do you counter the fact that maybe some of these experts have testified in a lot of trials, and maybe that's their line of living?
Well, every once in a while, every so often, you'll find a very brave and forthright doctor from within the very community that the event happened who will stand up to his fellows and testify that one of his colleagues in the same town, in close by hospitals, made a significant error that hurt somebody. Very, very rare. I've had some, like I said, very brave and honorable physicians do that over the years. Mostly, however, we can't go to Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or Cleveland or New York to get an expert to testify against a doctor or a nurse or a hospital in one of those towns. We end up with a Cleveland doctor testifying against a Pittsburgh physician, or a Pittsburgh physician against a New York physician.
The reason you have to go outside is what happens to the brave physician in the local community who stands up and testifies against one of his fellow physicians?
The tradition has been that they are, I think, shunned and ostracized, and it just is not done. It's
not just socially, but also professionally, right?
There have been instances where I've known of good experts who I've retained on cases who have been pressured, shall we say, by the forces that be, the authorities, the hospitals, their colleagues. We don't want you on this case, and I've had to replace them. The other question that you brought up is, what do you do when the defendants, as they always do, Steve, say, well, Dr. Smith, isn't it true you've testified 137 times in this state and that state and that state and so forth, in an effort to make the jurors believe that this person is just a hired gun, that they testify in whatever way the lawyer wants them to testify. They're challenging issues. The great witnesses, the great truth tellers in the medical world that are great witnesses do testify a lot.
Because you've been practicing law a long time.
Yes.
You have medical experts that you go to on a regular basis.
Right.
In different types of cases.
Many,
especially.
many.
Okay. Let's talk about, as our audience watches this case and they understand it's a medical malpractice case, would you define what medical malpractice is? And when I ask that question, I also want to say that oftentimes doctors will meet with a patient and the family and say, there are no guarantees here.
Right.
50-50 chance you're going to make it, 50-50 chance this, that, whatever. And I think in some respects that puts into the mind of the family or the patient that if things don't go right, I can't sue this doctor. But that's not always the case, is it?
No, it's not always
So
the
what
case.
is medical malpractice? It isn't just failing to cure a person. What is it?
No, bad outcomes can happen even when everything is done right. Medical malpractice is when a bad outcome, a death, a serious injury occurs because somebody didn't do their job right, or some nurse didn't do something right, or some hospital gave the wrong drug, and that's when there is a case that should be explored and pursued. You know, the statistics in our country, in spite of the complaints about the frequency of medical cases and the so-called frivolous cases, are that about 1 in 10 person who dies from a medical mistake or is seriously injured from a medical mistake ends up ever seeing a lawyer and pursuing a lawsuit. 1 in 10.
So 9 out of the other 10 should have sought a lawyer.
They go away, they don't know about it, they never discover it, or they're just not the kind of people who would ever think about filing a lawsuit no matter how horrible the events are.
So when you are in doubt, it doesn't hurt to contact a lawyer like yourself because it doesn't cost any money.
No.
To tell the facts, and then how do you evaluate a case and whether it's a legitimate medical malpractice case?
Well, the first and foremost thing is we never ever look at a medical malpractice case, unless there's been a really serious injury, a lifelong, life-affecting injury, or a death. Anything below that threshold cannot be pursued because it's just too expensive. By the time you hire these experts and look at these cases, it just can't be done.
Yeah. So typically it has to be something very serious.
It does. It has to be serious. And there are certain complications that can occur, infections almost always, and complications that can occur, as you pointed out, with any procedure where things can go wrong, even though the doctors and nurses did their best and there's a tragic outcome. And that's a tragedy for everybody. The doctors and nurses, to be sure, are always trying to do their best, and it's tragic for them as well. But there are others where you can look at circumstances, and we have a medical doctor and a nurse in our office who evaluate these cases, who can look at them and say, well, that's an event that should not have occurred, and that's a death that shouldn't have happened, or that's a crippling injury or a damage that should not have been inflicted on this patient.
Right. So the message that I hope we're sending out to America is that when you have a doubt about how your relative or you were treated, and it's serious, contact a lawyer.
Absolutely.
It doesn't cost any money.
Absolutely.
Let them evaluate with experienced medical help, right?
Yes, and they should get, we evaluate these cases by looking at medical records, and I've had 1,000 people sit in front of me in my office and say, but he told me this, and this is what happened, and no matter what is said, we have to look at those records.
Yes.
And the records really, in almost every case, dictate what we can do or not do.
Well, you did a great job on this, and I'm sure the Swartz family thanks you tremendously, and so do we for being on the show.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.